Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you and our Zoom audience from afar. It's a great pleasure to welcome Mike Swaddling to talk to us today about Clandon Park. Such an interesting building, such a tragedy, the fire, and why wasn't it rebuilt? And that's what we're going to find out. So it's a big welcome to Mike.
Thank you very much, Hamish. I'll start off with a few apologies because I've been ambushed technologically here. This is the first time that I've done a presentation where I have to keep still in front of the camera because I'm on Zoom, apparently. So that's going to be interesting itself. I think Will needs a big stick with a hook to keep pulling me over. It is also the first time, I was saying to my wife coming over here, that it's the first time that people have paid individually to see me, or to listen to me. Normally, 99.9% of these talks would be in front of groups, WIs and historical groups and things like that. So once again, I say it's a first for me. I do hope that you will be, you will appreciate the outlay that you've made. Okay, so at a recent talk of a version of this that I gave, I was a little way into it and I suddenly realized that the people in the audience hadn't been properly briefed by the person arranging the talk, because there were looks on faces as if they didn't know what or even who Clandon Park was, or that, let alone that there had been a tragic fire there. So a few facts may be helpful up front just to clarify that. Clandon Park is a few miles the other side of Guildford, on the road out to Dorking. It was handed over to the National Trust in 1956 after being in the Onslow family for the best part of 300 years. It's a Grade 1 Palladian mansion, or is or was, depending on your viewpoint, built in the 1730s, and the architect was Giacomo Leone. And it's generally regarded to be his finest work in the UK, Clandon House. But on the 29th of April 2015, a fire gutted the house, leaving not much more than its brick walls standing. So this talk is about that fire. It's about what the fire unexpectedly revealed. And that's what's led us to a bold and groundbreaking plan as far as the future of the house is concerned. So before I go any further, I need to check who's been to Clandon here. Most of you, before or after the fire? Okay, the people who've been before are the ones I feel sorry for, because you see the difference. If you've only been since, you can't imagine it. But I mean, if you've been before, then you've seen the beauty of its house. But and it is, you know, a tragedy. It's also good as a speaker to make certain there's nobody in the audience who knows more about your subject than you do. And I have been to one of these, and there was a chap in the front row who was there on the night. Right, okay, so all my presentation was directed at him, just looking for approval all the time. I did actually ask him if he'd come along to every talk I gave afterwards, but he wasn't interested. So, if you hadn't guessed already, this is what half the talk is about. Mankind's greatest invention. It's fascinating to us because it warms us, it cheers us, it cooks our food, but it also terrifies us because it can do this. So that's a view from afterwards. Okay. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, before the fire, Clandon wasn't one of the National Trust's local big hitters. Others in the area, like Polesden Lacey, for instance, they were the ones that pulled in the crowds. So you might have thought that a catastrophe like this would be the death knell for the house, but actually it wasn't. And since then, 2015, we've had 70,000 plus visitors. That's not bad, is it, for what is really a burnt out shell after all? So, you know, why on earth would that happen? Well, The fascination of fire, maybe, I don't know. When something like this happens, you can do one of three things. You kick down and build another desperately needed retail park or something there, leave it as it is, as they have done with places like, well, as part of Nyman's, for instance. If people have been to Nyman's, there's a wing there, hasn't it? It's been left from the fire in the 1930s, and Fountains Abbey further away. You just leave it as it is. Or you can restore it. And believe me, at the start, it was touch and go. Even the owner, the current Lord Onslow, had his doubts about what to do. So why, in the end, did the Trust decide to spend, the National Trust decide to spend an 8-figure sum on helping this phoenix to rise from the ashes? Well, hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll have a better idea. I'm going to give you a little bit of history, a little bit of architecture, and then add what happened actually on the 29th of April 2015 and what's happened since, and bring you up to date, and then finish finally with the recently announced revolutionary new plans for Clandon. So fasten your seatbelts. But just for a minute, linger a little more on this picture. The flesh of the house, if you like, may have gone, but the skeleton, the walls, is still there. Now, there are people that believe the houses have souls or spirits. And if that's the case, then maybe this is the house that's saying, I don't want to go yet. I'm not ready to go. The brick wall construction was a key factor in the decision finally to preserve it rather than knock it down. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the house. That's inextricably linked with the history of the Onslow family. We know that there was a house here in the mid-1500s, though it's not the one that we're talking about. The Onslows arrived here in about 100 years later in the shape of Sir Richard, the first Sir Richard. There were others. He was a politically upwardly mobile person, and he wanted a house within the current commuter belt, which in those days was a day's ride from London. So let me just move it. This lady then is Elizabeth Knight, who was the richest heiress in England of her day. And she became the wife of Thomas Onslow, who was the son of the Sir Richard. We're intrigued as to why, because from all the paintings we've got of him, he was no oil painting. So, you know, it's her money, and I think it was clearly his peerage, his position in society. So when so Elizabeth's money that basically paid for the house. When Thomas inherited the title of Lord Onslow in 1717, he didn't want an old house. It was the old one. His cousins said at the time that he had a notion of magnificence to suit his rank and fortune, and that did not include an old house. He had the money to pay for a new one, and that was his wife's money. So we got three other Richards, significant players. No other family has a greater link with the Speaker of the House of Commons than the Onslow family. 3 of them were at one stage or another Speaker, including an Arthur Onslow, who was the Speaker for 33 years. And we understand there are calls even today to bring him back. Right. We just move that on. Okay. The fashionable style of architecture of the day was Palladian, and that's named after a 16th century Venetian architect called Andrea Palladio. His style of architecture, for those of you who are interested, was built on symmetry, geometry, and Roman temple decoration and that kind of thing. There are only a handful of his houses in this style left in the UK. Probably the most famous one is Stowe. And so the fact that there were not many of them was another reason why the original decision was to rebuild rather than knock it down. Thomas Onslow spared no expense with his wife's money and hired one of the foremost architects of the day, another Venetian called Jacopo Leoni. And as I said, Clandon was felt to be his masterpiece, and that's recognized in the building's Grade 1 listing. I need to pause here just for a second and talk about the money, because it is a kind of elephant in the room. Elizabeth's fortune came from her family's sugar plantation in the West Indies, which means that the money came from slavery. And clearly this has had a lot of publicity in recent years. The trust has acknowledged that a lot of its houses were built on slavery money. They've been public about it. This is not the forum to continue that, but we do have to mention it. So I'm just going to bring the history quickly up to date then. After the house was finished, built, family's fortunes went up and down a bit in the next 150 years until the fourth Earl came along in the late 1890s, and he modernized it after 40 years it had been neglected. In World War I, it was a military hospital, and we have a separate presentation on that, which is actually quite interesting. And in World War II, it housed the Public Records Office. But after the war, it fell into disrepair again, and it was finally donated to the trust in 1956, who immediately undertook a massive restoration in order to open it to the public. And here you can see the main reason why. This is the house's pièce de résistance, the Marble Hall. So just feast your eyes on that, including the ceiling, with its jaw-dropping ceiling, absolutely. One of the many ironies is that the fire has revealed so much about the construction of this room that we would never have known otherwise. And I'll be coming back to that theme later on, what the fire has revealed that we would otherwise not have known. So, on the 29th of April, 2015, at around 4 p.m, a massive fire swept through the house, stripped away surfaces, opened up previously unseen views where archways had been panelled in and opened up again. And it revealed the bare bones and the secrets of the house. There was so much there that became visible that we were never meant to see, never meant to see. There's a view from the air. But it is almost impossible to find words to describe this scene. And that's what it looked like immediately after the fire, after all the loose debris had been. Even now, after all the debris has gone and you can walk through it, even now, nothing can prepare you the feeling when you first walk in and see that, especially if you knew what it looked like beforehand. It's absolutely heartbreaking. So, if there's a good time of the day to have a fire, then 4 p.m. isn't bad. The visitors are, you know, there's not so many. Most will come in the morning, but there are still staff on the premises, right? Let me get all of those up there. I'm sorry. One of the three most common questions is, how did the fire start? Well, I'll refer you to Surrey Fire Brigade's website. But the actual official is that it was an electrical fault down in the basement near the lift shaft, where there was a vacuum around the lift shaft. So as soon as there's a spark there, up it goes. And we'll be coming back to that as well again. It started in the south side because the south side was the oldest part of the building. It was old and it was dry, especially up in the attic rooms. The reason for that is, without getting personal, ladies and gentlemen, we all exude moisture. And in wooden buildings, that to some extent is absorbed, and that stops fire to a small extent. So in rooms like that are never used, where people don't go, that moisture isn't in the air, the wood dries out, and when the fire starts, it's like kindling. It just shot up straight and then shot back through the house before, you know, anybody could do anything about it. But most importantly, everyone on site was evacuated safely. Our evacuation procedure, which had recently been rehearsed, worked absolutely perfectly. And if you'd gone down there that night, including this chap that was in my audience before, you would have seen within a very short space of time a human chain outside the house. So the fire brigade were in there within 10 minutes. They would have formed a chain inside the house, but as soon as it came outside, then there were volunteers, there were people, local people, there were others from different National Trust houses nearby, all came up, and the stuff was being handed out in this chain. Every National Trust house, and I presume every non-National Trust, every country house, has an emergency plan which is agreed with the fire service, and it's regularly rehearsed. So they were there in 10 minutes, and we got 600 items around about that out. That was less than half of what was there. But the plan with the fire brigade almost certainly means priority order. In other words, what's the most important things, what has to come out? And there are stories of paintings where the fireman had to cut the painting out the frame because the frame was too heavy, but the painting was valuable. Somewhere we have a camera shot of a young fireman with a knife in his hand standing in front of a painting saying, "You want me to cut that out?" kind of thing. That's what went on. But the overall message basically is that nothing more could have been done than was done. So let's just have a look at the salvage phase. So this is the period of time from when the fire, when the building is declared safe, to when you can actually get in. That was about 5 months. So we couldn't get in till September from the April. And as you can see, they found different ways of getting into the building, including abseiling and that kind of thing, because the debris was so dangerous. So more, loads of trays, and outside salvage phase, and yeah, that took 9 months. There was a village, there was a tent village outside on the back garden, where, you know, and poly tunnels and everything to protect it, so on, and that was there for months and months. Just as an aside, here are some of the survivors. Things. The vases are Chinese vases, porcelain vases, which were rescued from the state bedroom. The Bible down bottom left is nicknamed the Vinegar Bible. It was rescued from the library. It had been printed in 1716. It's called the Vinegar Bible because there were lots of misprints in it. And the parable of the vineyard apparently came out as vinegar. So worth. You've got the painting down in the middle, and that's of the aforementioned Arthur Onslow, the speaker for 33 years. That's a painting by Hogarth, and that has national significance. So that was rescued as well. Top right then is a letter from Queen Charlotte to Charlotte, the second wife of Thomas Onslow, because Elizabeth, who provided the money, sadly died of smallpox at the age of 39 and never got to see the house as it was built. That's a letter from Queen Charlotte to Thomas Onslow's second wife. And the bottom right is a lovely little story. This is a tiny stoneware duck, which was part of the collection in the house, which had been made in Korea more than 600 years ago. We know that before the fire it was on the first floor, and yet it was found on the ground floor. And the only explanation they can come up with is that at some point it slid down a beam from the first floor to the ground floor, and it was discovered at the entrance as they went in. Fire is very unpredictable. And that's one of the things I found when I was going around looking after them. I've seen two identical dolls next to each other, one of which was burnt to a cinder, the other was hardly touched. And I don't know how you explain that, except to say that's how dangerous fire is, that's how erratic it is. So, before and after, that's what the library looked like before, and that afterwards. So in another case, you see at the top of the bottom picture, you see the brickwork, and we come back to that because a lot of it was panelled, but you know that burnt through very quickly. The state bedroom. Anyone with a large fashionable house in those days would have a state bedroom. They would hope that members of the royal family might just happen to pop in on their travels around the country. So you had a bed spare for them. Actually, because of the infrequency which that would really happen, the real function of the room was it was a showpiece for the state bed. And that was a highly expensive status symbol that all families had in those days. We know that the Clandon state bed was actually built in 1710, and that predates the new house. So it would seem that the hangings and the bedspread and the matching chairs and everything were one of the few things that Thomas decided to bring from the old house to the new house. Amazingly, a tapestry which had recently been cleaned and put under the bed survived the fire, and curtains from the room. So this is the state of the house once it all settled down, and then we started to look at, right, what are we going to do with this house? What's the best thing for it? Don't forget, it's a grade 1 listed house. What are we going to do with it? What followed? What followed was actually months, and that turned into years of painstaking analysis of the remains. Inevitably a highly laborious job. But if it had not been done, all that work, we would not have been led to the new and innovative plans that we've come up with for Clandon. Whereas in the past, all we could do was kind of archival research, nowadays we have an amazing array of technological help with it. Laser surveys, geophysics, archaeology, and something called dendrochronology. And that's the longest word I'm going to use this afternoon. And I'm sure somebody must know what dendrochronology is. It's tree ring dating, right? So you know that you can tell the age of a tree. Every year the tree grows another layer. And so you can tell the name of the age of a tree from that. That was a really big help, okay? In any fire of a magnitude like this, damage is done in 3 ways. It's the fire itself. Probably the worst damage is done from the fire hoses, the ferocious fire hoses. And the third is falling debris. And because so much of the horizontal structure was wood, the fire would then rip up it through floor by floor, causing these massive joists to fall sometimes as much as 70 feet within the building. So because of the very nature, the very size of these, they didn't burn all the way through. And that what enabled us, and this is one of the silver linings from the fire, that enabled us to use dendrochronology to acquire precise information that had previously we've only guessed at. And we can say with some confidence now that the trees used to make those joists and a lot of the rest of Clandon were growing in the pine forests of Finland in the winter of 1729, spring of 1730. That's a 6-month window over 300 years. I'm staggered every time I have to say that. I think it's incredible. But it does, we'd only guessed at that beforehand. And so now we knew for certain that that's when it was. And that was very helpful. And here's something else that the fire revealed that we might not otherwise have known. And unfortunately, I can't show it to you, but just to the left of the fireplace, it doesn't show up on this picture. In the building itself, there are these little strips of wood called laths. And you might have seen them if you've been to Shakespeare's Globe or something like that. This is how 18th century technology got plaster on the walls. These laths were made up into panels. The panels were then hung on the wall using, and you can just about see iron hooks up to the left of the fireplace and the right. They were called holdfasts. They were made by local blacksmiths. The panels were hung on those, and then the plaster was slapped on those. All right, and I say slapped. It was about 4 different layers of it. The first few layers had a lot of animal hair and sand and everything in them, but the last layer, the fourth, was the good quality plaster. That was the stucco. And we use the word stucco today to indicate, really top quality plaster work. It actually comes from the Italian stuccatori, who are the expert plaster makers who came over to Clandon all the way to make these. So this is not Clandon. It is also not a bunch of people having a picnic while they're watching a country house burn down. It is, in fact, the last National Trust house to burn down. Would anybody know what that was? Yeah, you're good. Well done. Okay. Okay, so Up Park, I'll give you a bonus point if you can give me the year. What did I hear over here? I'll take 89, 90, 89. 89 it was. The reason I put it up there is to indicate the difference in the attitude to tragedies of this between that in that 30 years. In those 30 years, generally, we have become a more inclusive, open society, if you like. And part of that is our attitude towards things like this. And maybe simplifying a little unfair to Up Park, but basically the attitude then was, look, I'm sorry, we are closed for 10 years, come back when we've finished. By the time we reached this happening in 2015, the attitude has changed. And very much one of the principles is we stay open as much as possible. We share this experience with the public, with National Trust members and so on. We want them to see it. We want them to see what we're doing. When I do the tours, I tell you, you've got to share the pain with the rest of us. Come around and see it. Come and see it as it is. So it stays open as much as possible. Okay, that's a nice bit of fancy marketing talk, I think. We need to keep it conserved. And what we have to show visitors when we reopen is actually more compelling than what it was before. As I said at the beginning, Clandon didn't pull in that many necessarily visitors. So what we want to do is to do that. And at the time we're talking about, 2015, 16, this was certainly one of, if not the biggest project that the Trust has ever undertaken. Right. So what did we do? We held an international competition, and then we came up with a winning design. And from then on, as I say, we've got that number of visitors, and sharing the experience went down very well from the start. People loved to be able to see it. Yeah, okay, when they first went in, they were shocked. But after that, by the time we'd done the tour, what we'd hoped to be able to do is we'd lifted the mood a bit, and we'd encourage people from that to say, look, this is awful, but look what we're planning. And hopefully by the end, you feel a little bit more encouraged, upbeat by it. Another of the common questions is the money. Show me the money. It's varied. Yes, the insurance has covered most of it. There will be a shortfall which we'll have to raise in other ways. At the moment, we're thinking that what we're planning to do from here on in is going to cost somewhere around about 15 to 20, which is a lot lower than it was at one stage. So, at the beginning of last year, so 2022, before we came up with these new plans, we finally started on site. Somebody's already asked me today, and I think it's another question we get a lot, which is, why did it take so long? Why did it take 7 years to get to a point where you start building? And it's a very interesting question. I'm here on behalf of the National Trust, but I have a personal opinion as well, and mine is simply because of the technology. There's so much more you can analyze now than you could do before. And it was a question, well, before we cover this up, let's just look at that. Let's just look at that. Let's just make sure of this. And that's what made the thing drag out. We're going to continue with the tours. I'll come back to those in a minute, but that may be something you're interested in. And possibly even expand into new areas where we can actually watch people doing the restoration work, which doesn't necessarily strike me as a nice thing for the restoration people. If you want somebody looking over your shoulder and pointing out the bits you've missed. But that's the thought. The idea is, you know, that we share that experience. Okay. Since the fire, then we've been conducting all these detailed investigations into the materials, because the more we understand about the materials that were used, the more sympathetic and appropriate the restoration could be. And the problem is that there were no records. Back in those days, in the early 1700s, no records were kept of how things were done. There was no manual on how to build a country house. It was all made up. In a lot of cases, the skilled artisans who did it probably weren't educated enough to write it down anyway. But it was jealously guarded, and the secrets and ways of doing things were only passed down by word of mouth. So we have no record at all of how things were done. So that's what we're doing. So repairing and stabilizing and conserving where we can the outer walls. Just have a look at the marble hall again. As I said, we have no formal description as to how sculptors created the plasterwork for this mind-bogglingly ceiling. As far as we understand, is that the shapes were made by constructing reeds or little bits of metal and then putting the plasterwork over the top of it. It's staggering to just look at the artwork. And this became, reconstructing something like this just became more and more daunting. So, if I'd been giving this talk to you about a year ago, I would have said now, okay, so the detail work is now concentrated on the house's fabric, the stonework, the mortar, and all that kind of stuff. It's a major program of works, which was going to take at least 2 years to do. Stabilizing the chimney stacks, repairing the balustrade up at the top, if you'll remember, up there, and repairing brick arches, but also fixing again some damage that had been pre-done before, but not brilliantly. We've been working with experts, specialist craft people who would ensure the work was to the same standard as the original. And using traditional materials and techniques, and using the ways to pass these skills on through apprenticeships and training and so on. So I always say to people when they walk in the building for the first time, if bricks are your thing, then you're in the right place here with Clandon, because the house was renowned from the start for its fine brickwork, intricate curves made with brick. Clandon is built, this area is built on clay, partly on clay. So that's an ideal constituent for, and clay and brick making was a traditional industry around here. And so we needed to be really careful about getting the right materials and going back to the original specification. This lady is a brickworks expert. She's been leading a team with specialist manufacturers to make sure that happens. You need to understand that when something like this happens, you can't go down B&Q, right? You cannot simply go down and say, can you give me your restored country house section or your Jacobean section, Jacobean or whatever, all right? It's a highly intricate process in making sure we get the right materials. That in itself would have been part of the reason for the length of time that it's been taken. So, quick word about the tours, some of which a number of you will have been on, obviously. They started in 2021, ran from May to September. COVID restrictions at the time, led by volunteers, which I was one, and believe you me, if you try to do a guided tour with a mask on, it's not very easy. The tours focus very much on the silver linings, which is what I've been talking about all the way through, the stuff that was revealed that we wouldn't have known if we hadn't had the fire. It's the supreme irony, really. It keeps coming back. The tours are constructed around the idea of the many hands that have built Clandon right the way through the centuries, and they ran last year and they just started again this year. So I would recommend that if if I've sort of created an interest here, that you should definitely go and look at the website and book. So that brings us up to date, almost. For those of you who like reading and like a twist in the plot, here it comes. Up till now, the idea had been always to restore the ground floor, the staterooms, to take them back to as closer a reproduction or a restoration as they were. We had different ideas for the floor above, possibly exhibition or museum space or something, but the idea was restoration. But over a period of time, two things had been becoming more and more clear. And the first was that the extent to which the fire had stripped the house, leaving only fragments of decoration, was making our original plans for restoration more and more challenging. And we came to realize slowly that given how little of the original had survived, there just wasn't enough from which we could restore. It would be more of a complete modern replication. And that would not be the right approach for a Grade 1 building. It wouldn't do the building anywhere near justice. Secondly, the more we cared for Clandon post-fire, the clearer it became how unique and valuable the building is in this fire-damaged state. What it tells us in this state. It reveals the story of how houses like this, and don't forget, we're not talking about just National Trust houses, we're talking about all the country houses across the country, hundreds of them, who would have been built in the same way. It shows how they were made and gives people an opportunity to have a completely new experience, completely different experience compared to going around other houses. Because, as I said, there are so many of these old houses built in the same way, 90% of wood, built with wood, that are in the same condition as Clandon was when everybody woke up on that morning of the 29th of April. The house has so much to tell us about all the many hands that made it, all the bricklayers and the stonemasons and everything, right up to the modern day, the scaffolders and everything. 31 miles of scaffolding around the house. And the screening on the scaffolding probably covers about an acre. I mean, you know, those people deserve the credit as much as anything. The interiors today consist of these fire-damaged spaces, dramatic fire-damaged spaces. You can go in places and look straight up through a cutout of the whole house, from the basement right the way up to the roof. And dramatic is the only word for it. These spaces, we're not going to restore them. We're going to leave them as they are and conserve them and make them fully accessible to people coming round to be able to look at. As our senior curator said, this is the nearest you'll ever get to an 18th century building site. And you can see some of the ways that people built in those days. Right, okay. So, the new plan then is to introduce sensitively designed walkways and platforms around the place on the walls to get people to explore the interiors at different levels with dramatic modern lighting, and a new roof, so a plastic roof right the way across the top of the building where you can go up and look down inside dramatic lighting again to be able to see from above just how these, how these houses were put together. And also turn around and you've got stonking views of the Surrey countryside at that height. My wife and I have done it. We've been up the scaffolding and had a look, and it is absolutely amazing. The house is the interior, so it's going to become active again. We're going to allow people in. We're going to have exhibitions and events. We're going to put up displays of the stuff that was saved and so on. Tell stories of many people that actually worked and lived at Clandon Park. The house is going to be full of stories. It may be a ruin, but it will be a living ruin. So things like that. You can see the dramatic effect. So to bring this to a conclusion, for those of you who love to go around country houses, this is going to change your view, the way you look at them forever. Because once you've been around Clandon as an architectural museum, you will be able to impress everyone with your knowledge of what's behind the walls of every other house you go to. That timeline sums up the project's past, present, and future. At the beginning, we were rather optimistically talking about 5 years. At the moment, we're talking about 12 years from the fire. So 27, something like that. So, ladies and gentlemen, Clandon is indeed a ruin. It will always be a ruin, but some ruins are very successful attractions. Go to Rome, for instance. There are one or two there that are not doing a bad tourist trade. We are going to make this ruin into a unique experience. Modern technology's opened up a window for us to be able to do that, and we can look at not only the way that the building was made, but also the lives of the people who lived in them. I said right back at the beginning, for those of you who remember, you can do 3 things with a house when this happens. But we found a 4th. We're not going to knock it down. We're not going to leave it as it is. And we're not going to restore it. To use a current vogue word, we are going to repurpose Clandon. And we hope you'll come and share the journey. Thank you very much.
You've got time for questions.
Yes.
Can you explain where the speaker's parlour is, please, in there?
Yep.
And why that one is being restored?
It's being restored because it suffered the least damage. Because
Whereabouts in the buildings?
Well, if I'd have to do it by north and south and west, all right? But if you go in the back entrance, if you've done one of the tours, then you'll go in the saloon entrance and you go through into the marble hall. The speaker's parlour is then over on your right-hand corner. That's the northwest corner of the house. And that had the least damage, and the decision is to restore that to what it used to look like, so that people can make a comparison and see that. The speaker's parlour was the old dining room. That's where the family used to dine, and so it was used all the time. And because that part of the house had more stone in it than wood, the house was probably built in 3 sections. And it started in the south section. That was where all the wood was. That's where the worst damage is. As it then moved through the building to the other side, the fire died out, and therefore the speaker's parlour largely survived. So that's okay.
Yeah. Are you saying the trust got it wrong in the restoration of that part?
No, I'm not going to be quoted on that. No, I'm just using it as comparison.
It's a very different approach.
It was indeed, and I went there. I went there twice. I mean, I went there beforehand. I also went after the restoration. I did see it, but I do think they did shut the doors. Whereas that's the difference I'm trying to.
Those are people queued up doors to see the damage. And this
Right.
is about 1990.
Okay. Without being too technical, the damage difference. The fire, it was a different kind of fire, and that enabled that to some extent. But there was no talk of actually sharing the restoration experience, watching people do that. But no, I'm not saying that.
I also remember they had a separate building that showed all the different, things that.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay.
I
Yeah.
have a question. What happened to the artifacts that you say? They're going back, or?
Well, I could tell you, but it's confidential. They're in a secret lockup somewhere in Surrey. They are being worked on. Again, you can do one of three things. You can either keep them as they are, you can restore them, or you can decide that in fact they're not worth anything, and you have to be ruthless with those, and they have to be then thrown away. So that's going through that process at the moment, but that's a long term thing. Yes.
You talked a lot about what you learned as a result of the fire, about how the building was done.
Yes.
Can you give some examples?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, indeed. What did we learn? Mainly the building techniques, as I think I tried to. Perhaps I didn't say well enough in the talk. It was actually confirming things that previously we would guess at, because there were no records. So, for instance, the way the walls were put together in the marble hall. For an example, on either side of the two marble fireplaces, you have two columns which look like marble as well. But unfortunately, one of them broke, and you'd see inside that it's hollow, and so you can see that it was actually plaster made to look very much like marble. It was constructed, marbling was put on it as well. And when I'm doing a tour, it always makes me laugh to think that there was some builder there, some Arthur Daly, if you know what I mean, who would be knocking on the marble and saying to Thomas Onslow, "Here, look up, genuine marble, absolutely." And of course, he's been uncovered now because it's hollow inside. That kind of thing, right? And lots of smaller stuff, which is of value to the curatorial team rather than to us. Yes.
You said there was a competition to work.
Yeah.
Who was going to take on the task?
Yeah.
Are you using the same people with your new scheme?
We are. Yes, we're doing it. We decided to. They have been very much part of the change of thought process. As volunteers, we're not privy to all of that, but it would never surprise me if they were the ones that almost kind of gently initiated that switch to, because they're the ones that are going to have to do it. The project team comes up with the plans, but and they may well have been saying, "Look, guys, we know you want to do this, but actually, this is looking more and more difficult," and it may well have been, but certainly it would have been together.
When we went there, we saw sketches, and I think there's a plan to make some sort on the roof.
Yes.
To have a sort of
rooftop cafe.
Restaurant.
Rooftop cafe. Yes. Very important. National Trust houses. Where the drinks come? Where are the refreshments coming from? Okay. And yes, initially the initial plans were the rooftop cafe. Brilliant. I mean, I would have been up there, but at the moment the talk is of little pop-up stations around the place. Little, portable coffee where people can buy drinks. They haven't really got that far with that yet.
You said that the building basically went back to Palladian architecture.
Yes.
And you mentioned stone.
Yes.
Did you, when all this was restoration, when you were learning about the fabric of the building, bearing in mind that a lot of the buildings of stone have actually been done up both internally, and the marble hall is amazingly similar.
Yeah.
Like a different shape, it's round.
Yeah. Yes.
And this one's square.
Yes. 40-foot cube, the perfect 40.
Sure. Yes.
Yes,
Like the columns and everything. And I just wondered whether you learned anything, or people had learned anything from Stowe itself.
Oh, without question, they would have gone there and looked at it and consulted, because clearly this is a national project, and that therefore people would have been called in who had, and I'm specifically, I don't know, but I'm certain they would have gone there. And I'm just trying to think, there were one or two others up north that Leonie designed, and maybe one in Norfolk, I can't think of the names, but which was similar. Because there are so few of these Palladian, you know, they needed to look at those to make sure, you know, that they were getting it right. Okay. Shuffle to one side.
What an interesting story, and how well presented. I mean, it's been a real joy to hear the story and to work with you as its progress. So it happened that Linda and I went there the week before the fire, and we then went there later and saw some of the architect's designs. It's time we went again.
Definitely is. We've just opened up the tours again,
Okay.
right? And there's certainly, you know, plenty of opportunities to go around again.
So Mike, a big thank you for joining us and talking to us
Thank
today.
you very much.